Right now, somewhere in your kitchen, there's a machine humming quietly that you never think about. You open it a dozen times a day. You've never once asked how it works. And if it broke tonight, you'd probably panic because everything inside, it would start dying within hours. But here's the strange part. That machine is barely 100 years old. For every other year of human history, every single one, people ate meat, drank milk, and stored grain without it. So how did they not just die? In the deserts of ancient Persia, over 2,000 years before electricity existed, engineers were building structures 40 feet tall that could freeze water in the middle of summer, in a place where the air temperature could hit 100 degrees Fahrenheit. No coils, no compressors, no power source at all. They were making ice out of thin air, in the desert, using nothing but clay, shadow, and physics. That single fact should be impossible. And yet, it's one of the least strange things you're about to hear. Two questions are going to drive everything from here. One, if refrigeration is so recent, how did civilization survive long enough to invent it? And two, what did we lose culturally and physically the moment we stopped needing to solve this problem ourselves? This isn't really a story about food. It's a story about how scarcity forces genius out of people who had no right to be that clever with the tools they had. Every method you're about to see was somebody's entire life's work, passed down because getting it wrong meant starvation. By the end of this, a fridge is never going to look like just an appliance again. A Roman fish sauce so valuable it was currency. A Persian ice dome that outsmarted the sun. A Boston businessman who sold frozen lake water to India and became a millionaire doing it. A French chef who cracked the code. Napoleon's army couldn't and didn't even know why it worked. And a home appliance so controversial the inventor was warned it might never sell. All of it coming up. Long before anyone wrote anything down, humans in cold climates figured out the first rule of preservation almost by accident. Cold slows decay. Bury meat in permafrost and it could last months. This wasn't science yet, it was observation. Somebody buried food to hide it from animals, came back weeks later and found it still edible. That accidental discovery is the exact same principle your fridge uses today, slowing the bacteria that cause spoilage by dropping temperature. The mechanism never changed, only the tool did. But cold wasn't available everywhere. So what did people do in places that never froze? Around 400 BCE, Persian engineers built structures called yakhchal, literally ice pit. Here's the trick. At night, in a dry desert, the ground and clean water can radiate heat directly into open sky and drop below the surrounding air temperature, even when that air is above freezing. Builders channeled water into shallow, shaded pools at the base of these domes overnight. Thin sheets of ice would form. Before sunrise, workers broke it and stored it deep underground in the shaded dome, insulated by thick clay walls and wind-catching towers that funneled cool air down and pushed hot air out. They weren't fighting the desert's heat. They were exploiting a gap in physics. The desert itself created the same principle NASA now studies for passive cooling on other planets. They didn't defeat the sun. They just waited for the 1 hour it looked away. Ice solved cooling for the wealthy and the clever. But most people on Earth never had access to a single degree below freezing. So an entirely different strategy had to be invented, one that didn't need cold at all. In ancient Rome, a fermented fish sauce called garum was one of the most traded goods in the empire. Fish were packed in salt and left to break down in the sun for weeks. It sounds disgusting. It was, by most accounts, delicious, and more importantly, salt-cured and fermented food could survive months at sea without spoiling. Salt pulls water out of bacteria through osmosis, and without water, bacteria can't survive. Fermentation went further. It used good bacteria to crowd out the bad ones, creating an environment where spoilage organisms simply couldn't compete. Garum wasn't a luxury food invented for taste. It was a preservation byproduct that people learned to love, meaning some of history's most beloved flavors, from cured ham to aged cheese to soy sauce, exist purely because someone was desperately trying not to starve. So salt and fermentation could preserve meat and fish for months. But what about a soldier or a sailor who needed food that would last years? In 1795, the French government offered a massive cash prize to anyone who could solve a problem that had crippled armies for centuries. Soldiers on campaign were dying from spoiled rations more than from battle. Napoleon needed food that could travel for months and still be safe to eat. A French confectioner named Nicolas Appert spent over a decade experimenting. His method? Seal food tightly in glass jars, then heat them. In 1810, he won the prize. Appert had no idea why it worked. Germ theory didn't exist yet. He'd stumbled onto the principle of sterilization, killing microorganisms with heat and sealing out new ones nearly 50 years before Louis Pasteur would explain the science behind it. He solved the how 5 decades before anyone understood the why. He didn't need to see the enemy to defeat it. He just had to seal the door. Appert's method could preserve food for years, but it couldn't keep things fresh, crisp, cold, raw. For that, the world needed ice on an industrial scale, and that obsession would make one American man unbelievably rich. In 1806, a young Boston businessman named Frederic Tudor had an idea people openly mocked: cut ice from frozen New England lakes, pack it in sawdust for insulation, and ship it by sail to the Caribbean and eventually India, some of the hottest places on Earth. Investors thought he was insane. Ships took months. Most of the ice should have melted before arrival. It didn't. Sawdust insulation was so effective that Tudor's company was still delivering ice profitably decades later, all the way to Calcutta, a round trip of over 4 months. Tudor didn't just sell ice. He built the demand for it from nothing, convincing entire cultures that cold drinks and fresh meat were a necessity, not a luxury, creating the consumer appetite that refrigeration would later be built to satisfy. He became known as the Ice King, and by the time he died, ice was a global industry employing tens of thousands of people every winter, cutting frozen lakes by hand. An entire industry now existed just to deliver cold. So what finally made humans stop relying on nature's ice and start making their own? On demand, at home? By the early 1900s, most homes still had an icebox, literally a cabinet cooled by a block of ice delivered by hand, several times a week by a man called the Iceman. It worked, but it was labor-intensive and imperfect. In 1927, General Electric released the monitor-top refrigerator, the first electric fridge marketed and priced for ordinary households. People were terrified of it at first. Compressed gas refrigerants of the era were genuinely dangerous, and many households refused to bring one inside. It took nearly 2 more decades of safety redesigns before refrigerators became the trusted, invisible kitchen fixture we know today. The thing you never think about twice was, for years, the thing people were too afraid to bring home. So the next time you open that door and grab something cold without a second thought, remember what's actually standing behind it. A Persian engineer reading the night sky, a Roman fisherman packing salt by hand, a confectioner sealing jars for a war he didn't fight, a businessman shipping frozen lakes across oceans, and generations of people who simply refused to let hunger win. You're not just storing food. You're standing at the end of a 4,000-year relay race. And for the first time in human history, you don't even have to notice you're holding the baton.